In Search of the Real Cleopatra. I have to admit to you that when I come to this lecture, I come with a difficulty and a personal belief. Cleopatra always will look like Liz Taylor. And secondly, Mark Antony will always look like Richard Burton. Some of you have seen this movie from the 1960s. 1963 it came out. Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, Mark Antony, and here's your trivia question for the night. Who was Julius Caesar? Rex Harrison, there we go. If you didn't know, I was going to give you a hint by saying the rain in Egypt falls, well, it doesn't rain in Egypt, does it? So, the movie Cleopatra came out in 1963, and it was the most expensive movie ever made. Even still today, not in dollars, but in equivalent dollars. And so, gearing in for inflation, the movie Cleopatra is still the most expensive Hollywood movie ever made in history. And actually, it's been in the news recently. This is a picture of the entry scene when Cleopatra enters into Rome to visit Julius Caesar. It's a huge production, unbelievable production, and she's dressed like the goddess Isis, or Isis, some people say. And you see this beautiful gold gown she has on. Well, this gold gown just sold a few weeks ago at auction in New York City, an un-Egyptian or an un-ancient Egyptian artifact. This gown just sold for $60,000. And it's not even made out of gold. It's actually made out of leather, painted gold. And it came up to auction in $60,000. But we're not searching for the real Elizabeth Taylor tonight. And so let's put her aside and see if we can't really search for the real Cleopatra. Cleopatra's story is a tragic, romantic story of history. She loved, she lost, she faced the snake, and then she died. But what is the truth, and how can we sort out the fact from the fiction? And part of sorting out the fact from the fiction is to talk first about her lineage and about some history, and then we'll talk about her life and her lovers. First off, you should know that Cleopatra was not actually an Egyptian woman. She was actually a Greek ruling Egypt. And so to understand how a Greek ended up ruling Egypt as the queen of Egypt, we have to go back into history from the time of Cleopatra about 300 years. It's when empires collided. The date is November 333 BC. The place is Isis. It's a little cove in the very northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. For 12 years, the Greek general, Alexander the Great, had been on a mission to conquer. Macedonian general, Alexander the Great. His father had been Philip the Great. And Alexander, at about the age of 30, sets out to conquer the world. He's been beating up on, do you remember the kingdom that was before the Greeks? The Medes and the Persians at this point in time. He's beating up on the Persians, and he has been advancing, and Darius had been retreating. They met at this place called Issus, the decisive battle. Now, it's interesting that Alexander the Great was so smart and so strategic that he picked this place for the battle, the decisive battle. He hoped it would be the decisive battle between him and Darius the Persian. When Alexander got there, he arrived first, and he did not choose the best position. Now, that sounds strange perhaps, but what he did was he scouted out the best position and he learned of its weaknesses. And then he took the second best position, knowing that when Darius came, he would take the best position. He knew immediately where Darius would go, and he knew the territory. He knew the weaknesses of that position. Very strategic idea, looking ahead to the next step. And so when Darius and the Persians came, sure enough, they chose that position. And so when the armies faced each other, the Persians had a decided advantage over the Greeks because, number one, they had the best position. And they also had more soldiers. But Alexander was more strategic. And so with superior tactics and strategy, Alexander won the day. This vase depicts the battle. But there's also a very fascinating mosaic. Some of you have been to Pompeii. And there's this fascinating mosaic on the floor of a house in Pompeii that shows Alexander looking very Greek. And he is fighting against Darius. He's here in the chariot. This is Darius looking very Persian. And they are fighting in this mosaic that's on the floor of Pompeii. Now, of course, you're talking about Pompeii. You're talking about this representation being made 400 years after the fact. So it is an artist's imagination of what the battle would have looked like. Have some of you seen this mosaic at Pompeii? Yeah, I knew a couple of you had. I know Candace had because she saw it with me. Actually, if you go to Pompeii today, this doesn't matter to anybody but a purist like me. The mosaic that's at Pompeii today is actually a copy, and the real one is in the museum at Naples. So that probably doesn't bother any of you, but those kind of things tend to bother me. After this decisive battle, Alexander the Great continued to go east. He dealt this crushing blow to Darius and chased his army home. He marched through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and finally he actually arrived at Darius's palace and conquered the city of Persepolis in Iran today. And Alexander the Great kept marching and conquering, and finally he got to Egypt in the year 332 BC on this campaign of conquering. He was welcomed as their new leader, as a liberator. Although it's interesting that they would have welcomed him in that way because he was actually a conqueror. Now, Alexander did some very smart and wise things to try to placate the Egyptian people. He visited all the Egyptian shrines. He went to the pyramids. He paid his respects to the mummified bulls because the bulls were sacred. There's a place where they kept all the bulls at the Serapeum. He visited there. He worshiped, and he sought to understand the religious ideas of the Egyptians and try to assimilate them into the Greek understanding. Typically, foreign rulers had not been welcomed in Egypt. And so Alexander the Great realized the best thing he could do is to try to become leader as Pharaoh. They'd had hundreds of pharaohs through 3,000 years. And so Alexander the Great decided he would try to become the next Pharaoh of Egypt. And how did he do that? Well, he got a little help from the Egyptian gods. And so very wisely, Alexander the Great went to an oasis out in the desert. It's named the Siwa Oasis. It's the place today where they're actually have looked a number of times for the tomb of Alexander the Great. But they still haven't found it. They think it's likely to be there. At the Siwa Oasis was a temple to the main god of the time, Amun-Re. Amun was kind of a composite god, but the main god, Amun, was a ram-headed god with horns. And so Alexander went to the oracle of the Siwa Oasis, and he consulted with the oracle, and the oracle came out and declared that the god Amun had spoken to him. And Alexander the Great, we call him, Alexander was the son of God. Interesting name, isn't it? Since we call Jesus the Son of God. The Son of God, the god Amun-Re. And how can one argue with the son of the god? And so the Siwa Oasis visit was immensely important. And so we can see these Egyptian carvings on the walls of temples in Egypt today. This is a carving of Alexander the Great. He doesn't look Greek in this picture, does he? He's very Egyptianized with a uraeus headdress and the elongated eyes with the eye of Horus. And not only is he depicted on this wall as Pharaoh, his name is also placed in these elongated circles. Do you remember what they're called? Cartouche. And only the ruler's name, only the Pharaoh's name, the king's name, was written in a cartouche. So this showed the royal identity of Alexander the Great. He is now the Pharaoh. And shortly after this, they issued a whole series of silver coins, beautiful silver coins called tetradrachmas. And you see in this picture, on this coin, you see he has horns? See the horns right here? This is because he is son of God, son of Amun-Re. And he is identified as the incarnate son of Amun-Re upon the earth. And of course, if Amun-Re is a ram-headed god with horns, so should his son have horns. And so, very typically, Alexander the Great is pictured like this. While he was in Egypt, he also returned to the coast, and he founded, from scratch, a whole new city in Egypt, on the coast. And can anyone guess what Alexander's city was named? Who founded Alexandria, right? There's a stupid question. He founded Alexandria from scratch. And then after he had founded Alexandria, he continued his march and he conquered all the way to India. But upon reaching India, his soldiers, as the story goes, his soldiers were tired. His soldiers said, "We're ready to go home." And so Alexander the Great turned his army around and started marching west again with thousands of miles before them. They reached they reached Iraq, what is today modern day Iraq. And instead of going into the city of Babylon, which was there, they bypassed it and went into the city of Borsippa. There is where Alexander the Great met his end. At the age of 33 years old, Alexander died in Borsippa. What did he die of? We do not know. Some say he died from alcohol poisoning because he was a horrible drunk. And perhaps while they were relaxing in Borsippa, maybe he went on a binge, and perhaps it was alcohol related. We don't know. Some say it was perhaps even liver disease brought on by all the excessive binges of drinking. Some say he was poisoned, but nobody really knows. Who would take his place? Who could possibly take the place of a god? And so as Alexander lay upon his deathbed, they asked him this question. He was asked by a priest, "Who will take your place? Who will succeed you?" And Alexander the Great's reply was Kratisto, which means the strongest, the most powerful, the most mighty. And so after his death, there was a period of instability. But he had four main rulers, or generals, I should say, four main generals who seemed to agree amongst themselves that instead of fighting each other to the death, there's plenty to go around. And so these four generals carved the Greek Empire up amongst themselves and agreed to leave each other alone. One general was named Cassander. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece, the homeland. The second general was named Lysimachus. He took Thrace and Asia Minor. So on back into the west, but still not typically the homeland. Seleucus, another general, received Asia and East Syria. And so he got kind of the area up north of the land of Israel. And then Ptolemy, the fourth general, got Egypt and Palestine, the land of Israel today. But they did squabble some, and Seleucus ended up taking Palestine. So Ptolemy ended up actually just in Egypt. Now, this is a lot of history, but it's fascinating how this history was prophesied in the Bible. The Bible gives us a very interesting prophecy about this empire, the Greek Empire. It's found in Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has this vision. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea." He has this dream, and he sees these four beasts. And I'm sure when he woke up, his wife said, "How'd you sleep last night?" And he said, "I had the craziest dream." But later on, an angel comes to him, and Daniel receives the meaning of the vision. Daniel 7:17, it says, "The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will arise from the earth." Now, this is Daniel 2. If you were here many months ago when we studied this is Daniel 7. If you were here many months ago when we studied Daniel 2, you'll remember that was all about kingdoms too. Remember, Daniel 2 was about this multi-metal man, and the head was one kingdom, Babylon. The arms of silver and the chests of silver were Medo-Persia. The bronze or brass midsection, belly and thighs were Greece, and then the legs were of iron and the feet of iron and clay, which was Rome, and then the breakup of the Roman Empire. We saw this before, this division of empires. The head of gold, Babylon, as I said, the chest and silver, Medo-Persia, the belly of brass is Greece, and then the legs of iron equal Rome. We have this in Daniel chapter 2. Now, what you have to understand is in Daniel chapter 7, we have a parallel vision. It covers the exact same territory. It does go further than the vision of Daniel 2. And so we have in the vision of Daniel 7, we have these four beasts, fascinating beasts. One is a lion with wings. The second one is a bear with three ribs in its mouth, raised up on one side. The third one was a leopard with wings and four heads. And then there was the fourth beast is some people call it the nondescript beast, but there's a huge description of the beast. So I call him the monster beast. Good imaginative name. And then later on there's some other stuff that comes up with that beast with the horns and stuff. But Daniel has this vision, four beasts, four kingdoms, and Daniel chapter 2, four metals, four kingdoms. Do you see the parallel? And so the lion was a symbol of Babylon. The bear was a symbol of Persia. The leopard with the wings and the four heads was a symbol of Greece, and the terrible beast the monster beast was a symbol of Rome. And so since we're talking about the Greek Empire, I want to think about this third beast for just a moment. A very fascinating beast. A leopard with wings and four heads. Daniel 7:6 says this. "After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, a third one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had four wings like those of a bird. The beast had four heads, and it was given authority to rule." This is the Greek beast. And notice these fascinating details. The four wings symbolized the speed at which Alexander the Great conquered the world. Unbelievable. In just a few years, he conquered the then known world. But then also, think about this. When the king dies, when Alexander dies, there are 4 heads, which symbolize the 4 generals that took over at the death of Alexander the Great. It's a fascinating prophecy that is being prophesied about 300 years before the events that I'm telling you about in history actually happened. And so it's a very fascinating study. Any good history book will give you this history about Alexander the Great. Now, it's interesting that this prophecy is so exacting because, as I say, it was written 300 years before it happened. Now, modern scholars say that the book of Daniel was not written in 600 BC, as I believe, but modern scholars say the book of Daniel was actually written in 100 BC. Now, why would they believe it was written in 100 BC? Because all of the events have already happened. And so what they say is Daniel is writing history, acting like he's writing prophecy. That's not true. The book of Daniel prophesied what was going to happen and all these things. It's so accurate that modern scholars say that can't have happened. But it's so accurate. And so this is why the Greeks ended up in Egypt. Because these 4 generals divided and carved the empire up. And the guy who came to Egypt was a general named Ptolemy. We call him Ptolemy the First. But his people would have known him as Ptolemy Soter. Kind of his nickname, or his given name, Soter. Now it's very interesting that in order to capitalize on his control of Egypt, he actually sent an army out as they were bringing the body of Alexander back from Babylon, or from Borsippa. He actually sent an army out and hijacked the body of Alexander and brought it to Egypt. And so Alexander the Great is most probably buried in Egypt, but we have no idea where. But he wanted to do that to give him some legitimacy. And so it's interesting how Ptolemy he was a Greek, how he became Egyptian. Look at these pictures. On the left, it's a very Greek-looking picture. It's a very Greek-looking bronze statue. On the right, it's Ptolemy the First. He dresses himself to look like in the line of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And so he claims the throne of Egypt and puts himself in the role of Pharaoh and dresses in this way and writes his name in a cartouche, as all the ancient pharaohs had done. But he also calls himself Ptolemy Soter. Greek word, Soter. Anybody know what the Greek word Soter means? No? Savior. Jesus is called Soter, our Savior. Ptolemy is Soter. He is the Savior of Egypt. And so he portrays himself as the one who has come to save Egypt. Now, who's he saving Egypt from? I'm not sure. Because if Alexander hadn't come in and beaten up on Egypt in the first place, they wouldn't have needed to be saved. He minted coins for himself, for Egypt, but instead of putting his own picture on the coins at the beginning, he put on the picture of Alexander the Great, because he wants to connect himself with Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great was the great Pharaoh. He was the son of God, the God general. I mean, he was everything. And so Ptolemy the First Soter, he wants to connect himself with Alexander. But he doesn't. He doesn't put his own picture on. Notice in this picture, you see the horn again? Alexander the Great. When you leave tonight, if you'd like to, I have a very fascinating coin of Alexander the Great in my pocket I'd like to show you before he leaves. He was a brilliant leader. He solidified his power by by worshiping as an Egyptian would, by claiming the Egyptian gods, and by dressing himself as an Egyptian. He also began what is probably one of the most well-known ancient Egyptian institutions of all time, the Alexandria Library. It was Ptolemy I's goal to have a copy. Of course, they were on scrolls, you understand. It was his goal to have a copy of every book that had ever been written in the whole world. And so when a ship would come into the Alexandria harbor, they would send soldiers out and they would search the ship for any book on board. They would borrow the book, bring it to the library, have a scholar or a scribe copy the book on papyrus, and then after the book was copied, they would take the copy back and give it to whoever they had stolen from. But they kept the original. It was their goal to have every book ever in the world. And then when he died, he was also proclaimed deity, and so you'll see pictures of Ptolemy I. You'll see coins of Ptolemy I that actually have the horn on it, just like Alexander the Great. He was succeeded by a guy named Ptolemy. Thank you. There are 13 rulers in the Ptolemaic dynasty, and all 13 of them are named Ptolemy. But they take different names after it. And so this is the second guy. Of course, he didn't name himself Ptolemy II. He didn't call himself II. He just called himself Ptolemy Philadelphus. Ptolemy sister lover. And so it's interesting that his pictures show him and his sister. They were married, which was very common in that time because they didn't want to corrupt and ruin the Greek bloodline with the native Egyptians. And so Ptolemy Philadelphus reigned from 284 to 246 BC. I only tell you about him because he did something that is so important. We still use it today. He found an Egyptian priest whose name was Manetho, a scribe of the sacred shrines of Egypt. And Manetho sat down to write a history of Egypt. And what he did was he looked at all the ruling families and divided Egypt into a general scheme of, anybody know what they're called? Dynasties. And the scheme that we use today to look at ancient Egyptian history is the scheme of Manetho. And so this was very, very important time period. And Manetho used all these ancient king lists that were written on walls. Ptolemy II also did something else that was very important. He built the Alexandria Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was incredible. The world's first lighthouse. It was built on a little island out in the Alexandria harbor named the island of Pharos. It was the world's first lighthouse, 300 feet high. On top, how did they keep a light going? They had a bonfire burning on top. Can you imagine having to get all the wood 300 feet up to keep that bonfire burning all the time? And then they also had a huge polished bronze mirror that they would keep behind it to reflect the light of the fire out into the harbor. It said that it could be visible from 35 miles out at sea. Incredible. And we know that it was functional until at least AD 650. And at that point in time, it was destroyed by an earthquake. But interestingly, recently, they've been doing some excavations in the harbor of Alexandria and have found lots and lots of pieces of the ancient Pharaoh's lighthouse, the first lighthouse of the world. It's very fascinating. Altogether, they've discovered over 30 sculptures. One side collapsed into the sea after the earthquakes, and so they're discovering it. But also in these excavations, they're discovering a large palace that's also been swamped by the water. And they believe that this is probably Cleopatra's palace. and believe that this is probably actually an ancient sculpture of Cleopatra that they've discovered there in the harbor. And here is a sphinx, probably also with Cleopatra's face. It's a prettier sphinx than most of them, don't you think? So it's a nice looking object. If any of you wanted to get it for me, we could make plans for that. I'll jump ahead to another king whose name is Ptolemy V. His name was Epiphanes, Ptolemy Epiphanes, the word meaning the one who is shown by God. And he also is important not because of what he did, but because of what some other men did. He's important because of a decree that was passed by a general council of priests of the Egyptian clergy on the 27th of March, 196 BC, on the first anniversary of his coronation. The priests wanted to say how much they loved King Ptolemy Epiphanes. And so they wrote it out on this large stone that many of you know about. It's called the Rosetta Stone. And if it hadn't been for Ptolemy V and these priests who wanted to tell him how much they loved him, we would not have the Rosetta Stone. And of course, the Rosetta Stone is important. It was found near a place in Egypt called Rosetta. And it's important because it contains two languages, Egyptian and Greek, and it's written in three different scripts. This is the hieroglyphic script. This is kind of the shorthand version, kind of like the cursive version. It's called Demotic. And then here is the Greek portion. And so this, if you've been to any of my other lectures, you know was very important because this discovery led to the decipherment of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was done by a guy named Jean-François Champollion. And it was based on the names that he was able to find on ancient monuments that he was able to use the Rosetta Stone to discover how to interpret hieroglyphs. And it's important here because the first name he found on the Rosetta Stone was the name of, it's in the cartouche, so it's not Alexander, it's Ptolemy. That's his name in hieroglyphs. And then on another monument, he found this name, the name of Cleopatra in hieroglyphs. And so Champollion uncompacted these in a way that seemed to make sense. And he began working with them and figured out that indeed the Rosetta Stone and ancient hieroglyphs were a phonetic script, and he went on to be able to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. And it was at this point in time that we learned that indeed Alexander the Great had been a king, because they found his wall carvings, and they say Alexander in these wall carvings. The Ptolemaic line continued on. There were 13 pharaohs named Ptolemy. They had wives. You would think they would use some more some more imagination, but all the wives were named either Arsinoe, Bernice, or in Greek Bernike, or Cleopatra. Now, when we think of Cleopatra, we think of Cleopatra, but she was actually the seventh queen named Cleopatra. And they were all named Arsinoe, Bernike, or Cleopatra. Well, as time passed, the girth of the kings increased. As a matter of fact, there's one king, they called him Ptolemy Fatty. That was his name, Ptolemy Fatty. Their girth increased, but their power decreased. And primarily through incestuous intermarrying, they kept the line mostly Greek. That's the history. Now we come to that seventh queen, whose name is Cleopatra. queen of Egypt. She ascended the throne in 51 BC. Her father was Ptolemy the 12th. Her mother was unknown. We still don't know who her mother was. Probably a concubine. And yet she was in line to become the queen of Egypt. At age 17, she became the queen of Egypt. She ascended the throne at her father's death, and her husband / brother, Ptolemy the 13th. Hey, you guys are catching on to this, aren't you? He was also on the throne with her, but he was only 10 years old. And so for all practical purposes, she was the ruler. But some of his advisors started saying, no, she shouldn't be the throne. She tried to seize power as the primary ruler, but these advisors tried to prevent it. Finally, Egypt was on the verge of a civil war, but there were more important things happening in the ancient world at that point in time than just this little civil war in Egypt, because there was another force, another power that had come upon the ancient scene. His name was Julius Caesar. Rome had just been through a horrible civil war. Julius Caesar had come out the winner. One of his generals named Pompey the Great had lost. And when Pompey lost, he fled to Egypt, thinking perhaps they would protect him. And so Julius Caesar led an army to go to Egypt to try to find Pompey the Great. Well, when he got there, he told them he was looking for Pompey, and Ptolemy the 13th, the boy, had suspected that he would be coming after him to look for Pompey. And so Ptolemy the 13th's friends had tracked Pompey the Great down, had murdered him, and cut off his head. And when Julius Caesar landed, they handed him a basket with the head of Pompey the Great. Now, they thought that Julius Caesar would be overwhelmed with gladness. But in fact, his attitude was, what are these pig Egyptians doing killing a Roman? He was not appreciative. And that kind of got them off on the wrong foot in the first place. Well, in the midst of all this, Caesar found out that there was this potential of a civil war between Ptolemy the 13th and his sister Cleopatra. And so he exerted his power to try to prevent it. But then something happened. Cleopatra wanted to meet Julius Caesar, but how could she? And so her trusted servant Apollodorus, this is the traditional story. I think it's probably similar to how it actually happened. Although, can you really think that that's a rolled up rug? So the story is Cleopatra hid herself in this rug, and Apollodorus comes in. This is actually a scene from the movie Cleopatra. Apollodorus comes in, and I started to say Elizabeth Taylor comes out. No, she doesn't come out. Cleopatra comes out and meets Julius Caesar, and quickly he becomes taken with her. There's an ancient historian, Roman historian, whose name is Plutarch, who writes about this. He says this bold stroke so caught the fancy of Caesar, who admired such daring invention, that he quickly reconciled her to her brother and reinstalled them as co-rulers of the kingdom. Now, can you trust Plutarch? That's always a question. I mean, I know some of you go to bed at night asking yourself that question. Can you trust Plutarch? Of course, the victors always write the history. And so I'm a little bit cautious about what Plutarch says, but he's still the best source we have. So Cleopatra meets Caesar. Caesar is 52 years old. Cleopatra is 18. Do any of you just kind of go, ooh? But that's the way it was. We know little about her appearance. Plutarch describes her like this. He says her actual beauty was not in itself so remarkable. It was the impact of her spirit that was irresistible. The attraction of her person, joined with the charm of her conversation and the characteristic intelligence of all she said and did, that was bewitching. It was a delight merely to hear the sound of her voice, as if this were an instrument of many strings. She could pass from one language into another. Cleopatra is actually the only Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who took the time to learn to speak Egyptian. All the rest of them just spoke Greek. As a matter of fact, it's said that Cleopatra knew 7 different languages. And it seems as though you've met people like this, haven't you? Women who are not the most beautiful women, and yet when you spend time with them, you feel like they may be. And that seems like that's the way it was with Cleopatra. Her portraiture actually suggests, she had a big nose. Doesn't it? Looks like she had, and the one on the left-hand side looks like it was kind of beak-shaped. I can't imagine that she would have been happy with that picture on that coin. Yeah, she's not on the Wizard of Oz, take my word for it. She identified herself as the goddess Isis. And so oftentimes on Egyptian carvings, we see her, and her nose is much smaller in this picture, but we see her dressed with this beautiful Isis costume. She was educated and well-spoken, and Caesar was taken with this young woman. And some say perhaps even that night, after having met her for the first time, that they actually became lovers that night. Within a couple months, Caesar thought that everything had been taken care of in Egypt, and so he set sail to Egypt to claim his place back in, he set sail from Egypt to claim his place back in Rome, but he had stayed long enough in Egypt to have a child. His name is Caesarion, Little Caesar. She didn't name him a Egyptian name. She named him after his daddy. So we have these pictures on ancient carvings of Caesarion. On the left-hand side, you have Cleopatra as Isis. On the right-hand side, you have her son, Caesarion, as an Egyptian god, because of course she was the god Isis. Cleopatra proclaimed Caesarion to be the child of Amun-Re through the human agency of Julius Caesar. But Cleopatra was not going to let Julius Caesar slip through her fingers that easily. And so she got on her beautiful barge, sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, came to Rome, where she had aspirations that she would be declared not simply the Queen of Egypt, but the Queen of Rome itself. But there's a little problem back in Rome. Julius Caesar has a wife already. Of course, you knew that already. And so when she gets to Rome, even though it's a grand and glorious entry, people don't trust her and people don't like her. And there's something else going on in Rome at this point in time. Beware the Ides of March. While Cleopatra is in Rome, Julius Caesar is stabbed to death by Brutus and his co-conspirators on March 15, 44 BC. And when Julius Caesar's will was read, Cleopatra hoped, prayed that Caesarion would be his heir. But Caesarion was not mentioned in the will. As a matter of fact, a nephew of Caesar's was named his heir. His name is Octavius or Octavian. And so Cleopatra gets back on her boat, sails back to Egypt a broken woman for a while. Enter Mark Antony. If you ever want to do research on this guy, you have to remember his name is Antony, not Anthony. Because if you get on Google and type in Mark Antony, you're going to get a rock star, a singer today. This is Mark Antony. He's one of Caesar's, Octavian's friends. They kind of split the empire up to govern a little bit. And Mark Antony has Egypt. And so when Mark Antony goes to visit Egypt for the first time, he's met Cleopatra before, but Cleopatra invites him to a special dinner on her boat. And they go sailing off into the sunset. You understand what I mean? Sailing off into the sunset. And they fall in love, and they go all the way from Alexandria to Tarsus and back to Alexandria. And Cleopatra once again wins the heart of a Roman leader. And so it is that for a while they kind of hang out in Egypt, and this Mark Antony doesn't have many aspirations, but it seems to me that Cleopatra was the one with the aspirations. And so they build a huge fleet of ships. The Egyptian army, the Egyptian navy, 500 ships. And the goal is that they will make a play, Mark Antony and Cleopatra together will make a play to defeat Octavian, and they will rule the Roman Empire. There are coins minted. This is a Mark Antony silver denarius. And the ships were so important. You see the galley here. It's on his coin. These are Roman standards, army standards. But here's the ship to commemorate this huge navy that Mark Antony and Cleopatra made. And so it appeared that perhaps they could wrest the Roman Empire from Octavian. The battle was at this place called Actium Bay. It was a battle where Antony's army was large and he had more boats, but they were badly defeated. And Cleopatra believed that Antony had died in the battle, and so the ship she was watching the battle from sailed back to Egypt and left, believing Antony was dead. But Antony saw that Cleopatra was leaving him. And instead of making his last stand against Octavian, the heart got in the way. And he left. He left his navy without a commander to chase Cleopatra down. No wonder they made a movie of this with Richard Burton and Liz Taylor. I mean, it's a love story. She believed that Antony was dead. And so when she arrived back in Alexandria, she hid away. The belief was that she had died. And so when Antony finally arrived back in Alexandria, he heard that she was dead. And he ran himself through with a sword, killing himself. The story is that they actually took his body to her before he actually died. But I suspect that's Hollywood instead of real fact. Makes a better story. So with Mark Antony dead, Octavian marches his army into Alexandria, comes by sea, docks in the harbor, marches his army into Alexandria, and there he takes Cleopatra prisoner. Plutarch the historian, and whether he's to be believed or not, again, is a question. But I'm going to tell you the traditional story that Plutarch tells about Cleopatra. Plutarch tells us that Cleopatra died by a snake bite, a cobra or an asp. It's an interesting choice for her to choose to end her own life, because the cobra or the asp had always been the protector of the Pharaoh. You see here on this golden mask, you see the cobra. He was a protector of the Pharaoh. Here's another one. This was found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The protector of the Pharaoh. But Cleopatra chooses rather to use the asp or the cobra to end her life. And so, through the agency of the sacred cobra, the sun god welcomed his royal and holy daughter into the pantheon of Egyptian gods and goddesses. And she died by the bite of a cobra. The robes in which Cleopatra died, she died in the movie, she dies in this outfit, but she actually did die, Plutarch tells us, dressed as Isis, because for her, she wasn't dying. She was joining the other gods and goddesses. This Ptolemy, this Macedonian Greek queen, was never more Egyptian than she was in her death. And so Cleopatra died. Octavius is angry that the victory of her death has been stolen from him. He wanted to take her and display her in Rome. He wanted to take her and show her off as his victor over her in Rome. But plundering her treasures and wealth and the grain of Egypt, Octavian was able to consolidate his power, and Octavian makes good on all of his promises back in Rome, and Octavian becomes the ruler in Rome for 43 years. But perhaps, though, you don't know him very well, because you know him by a different name. Just read it. Caesar Augustus. You didn't know you could read Latin, did you? Caesar Augustus, the emperor who was the Roman emperor when Jesus was born. In fact, Cleopatra and Antony were doomed from the start, because that prophecy in Daniel chapter 7 that had said the Greek Empire was going to rise, was going to have these four heads, these four generals, division, and then something else happens in the vision. There's a fourth beast, and the fourth beast was the Roman Empire. When empires collided, Greek passed off the scene, the Romans came on. It was foretold in the Bible. God says that empires will also collide once more. Here's a fascinating finish of that prophecy in Daniel 7. Daniel 7, 9 through 10 says this: "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened." This is a judgment scene in the book of Daniel. It's a fascinating scene. God is on the throne. I like this. God is on the throne. In the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7, it ends with God on the throne. Never forget it, folks. God is on the throne. And even when it seems like he's not on the throne, I'll remind you of this. God is on the throne. The book of Daniel chapter 7 portrays God is in charge. And even when it seems like to our limited understanding that God is not in charge, Daniel 7 tells us God is in charge. And by my faith, sometimes I don't understand that, but Daniel says it and I believe it. God is on the throne. God is in charge. Look what happens next. Daniel 7, 13 and 14. Daniel says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man." This is not Alexander the Great here. This is Jesus himself, the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. When empires collide, according to the book of Daniel, when empires collide again, this time on a cosmic level, this time in the universe, this time God's throne and the powers of Satan's throne, they'll collide again. And what happens? It says he will be given authority, glory, and sovereign power. There will be a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And then it ends up with this. The Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. God came to this judgment scene. And judgment was given in favor. I don't want to know how many of you have ever been in court. Don't raise your hand. But if you were in court and the judge looks at you and says, verdict for, you're always going to be the defendant. Verdict for the defendant, you, how does that make you feel? Pretty good. This says judgment is given in favor of the saints of the Most High. Before that it says this, the four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth, but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. And then it says this, the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. The Bible tells us that one of these days, cosmic kingdoms are going to clash, and God's kingdom is going to be the victor. And how can we be a part of that victory? By being God's. By being a part of his kingdom. By being his people. I like the middle of this verse. At the middle of the verse it says that the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. That's my goal. That's my hope on a personal level, that I'll be one of those people. Jesus says this in the New Testament in this way. He says this, how can we be part of that kingdom? He says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added to you as well. That's what I want to do. Seek God's kingdom first, always. Let's pray as we close this part of the lecture. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for these wonderful passages in the book of Daniel that reveal to us that because you will be victorious in the very end, we can also be victorious. Thank you for reminding us of that. Sometimes there's so many bad things that go around and go along around us, and sometimes it can be discouraging. But thank you for reminding us again that ultimately we can win by being on your side. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.